My name is Emily Carter. I'm 24 years old. 2 days after burying my brother, I was still drowning in questions no one would answer. My parents told me his death was an accident, told me not to dig too deep, told me to let it go. But the night the storm hit, I opened my door to find him standing there, soaked, trembling, alive, and clutching a letter that revealed why they had tried to bury him in the first place. From that moment on, I realized the funeral wasn't the darkest thing about my family. The real horror was the secret they would do anything to keep buried. 2 days after lowering my brother into the ground, the silence in my house had become unbearable. The flowers people had sent after the funeral were already sagging, their petals shriveled at the edges, releasing a heavy, almost sour fragrance that lingered in the air like a reminder of grief no one could escape. I hadn't slept properly since that service. I kept replaying the scene in my head, the speeches about how kind he was, the photographs lined along the church walls, the neatly polished casket that we were told held his body. Everyone clung to the same script: an accident, a tragedy, an unfortunate loss we weren't supposed to question. Every time I asked how it had happened, my parents' voices turned clipped and dismissive, always with the same rehearsed answer: "Don't dig too deep, just let it go." But how could I? My brother's death had come out of nowhere, and there were no details, no explanation, nothing but a sealed story they expected me to accept. That night, the storm outside sounded like it was tearing the sky apart. Rain pounded against the windows, wind clawed through the trees, and I sat in my living room staring blankly at the carpet, trying to convince myself I was simply exhausted. I wanted to shut my mind off, but the unease in my chest wouldn't let me. I was still in that half-dreaming state when it happened. Sharp, frantic knocking at the door. It wasn't the polite kind of knock, not even the insistent pounding of a neighbor. It was the sound of desperation, fists slamming against wood as though life depended on it. My pulse jumped. For a second, I couldn't move. I stood in the hallway, staring at the door like it was about to split open, until instinct took over and I unlocked it. What I saw made my entire body lock in place. My brother, James, stood there, soaked from the rain, shivering so hard his teeth clicked together. His face was pale, thinner than it had been just a week earlier, his eyes wide with a fear I had never seen in them before. In his hands was a sealed envelope, crushed and damp from his grip, and the way he held it told me it was the only thing keeping him standing. For a moment I thought I was dreaming. But then he spoke, his voice breaking on every word. "Don't tell them I'm here. Please." They tried to bury me alive. I barely got out. The words hit me so hard I forgot to breathe. I pulled him inside before the storm outside could swallow him again, my mind racing with too many thoughts to settle on one. I kept staring at him, at his clothes, torn and muddied, at the deep lines under his eyes, and every part of me screamed that this was real. My brother wasn't dead. They had lied to me. James staggered into the living room, collapsing against the couch as if his body couldn't carry him anymore. He held out the envelope to me with trembling hands, his voice raw. "This letter, it proves everything. It's why they wanted me gone. And now they'll come for you too." My fingers shook as I took it. The paper was damp from rain but sealed tight, heavy with the weight of whatever was inside. I tore it open, pulling out a stack of documents, each one covered in signatures and dates. At the very top was a will, my grandfather's name written clearly across the header. My stomach twisted as I read further. The inheritance he left behind, everything he owned, his land, his money, the kind of wealth I never even realized was in our family, had been left not to my parents, but to James and me. It was all supposed to come to us. But the documents had been hidden, the signatures altered, the trail buried so deeply I never would have known unless James had put it into my hands. My thoughts came in jagged fragments. My parents had staged his death. They wanted him erased so they could take everything for themselves. And they hadn't just lied. They had nearly succeeded in burying him alive. James leaned forward, clutching his hands together like he was trying to hold himself together. "I don't know how much time we have. They'll realize I'm not in that grave. Once they do, they won't stop until we're both gone." His words came out in short bursts, as if every breath was stolen from him. I sat there, staring at the will, the forged signatures, the confession in black ink that revealed the truth of what they had done. My entire life had just shifted in an instant. My parents, the people who had raised us, who had insisted we trust them, had become strangers, predators disguised as family. And now the weight of their secret sat in my hands, undeniable and sharp enough to cut through every memory I had of them. The next morning, I couldn't pretend to live like nothing had happened. I stood in the kitchen with James beside me, both of us silent, waiting for the moment we would confront them. Every second stretched unbearably, the house filled with tension as though the walls themselves knew what was coming. When my parents finally came downstairs, they froze at the sight of James standing alive in front of them. My mother's face drained of all color. My father's hand gripped the chair so tightly I thought it would snap. I held up the letter before either of them could speak. My voice didn't tremble. "You lied. You tried to bury him. You tried to erase us." Then I began reading out loud, each line cutting through the air like a blade. With every sentence, the mask on their faces cracked. By the time I reached the end, my father had collapsed into a chair, his breathing shallow, while my mother dropped to her knees, tears streaming as she begged us not to destroy them. And in that moment, as James stood beside me and our parents broke apart in front of us, I understood something I had never wanted to see. Their darkest secret wasn't that they had faked my brother's death. It was the truth of how far they were willing to go for greed. And now, the decision of what came next was ours. The silence that followed my parents' collapse was the kind that gripped the air so tightly you could hear your own heartbeat pounding against your chest. My mother knelt on the floor, sobbing, her voice shaking as she whispered apologies that sounded hollow and rehearsed, while my father sat hunched in the chair, his head hanging low, his face pale with shock. James stood beside me, his body tense, his eyes locked on them like a soldier waiting for an attack. For a moment I thought maybe they would deny everything, but the way their bodies folded told me they already knew the truth was exposed. I didn't let the silence linger. "You knew what Grandpa left us," I said, my voice sharp and steady. "You knew, and instead of being honest, you tried to erase James from this family. You buried your own son for money." My mother lifted her head, her mascara smudged in streaks across her cheeks. "We didn't have a choice," she said quickly, her hands clutching the hem of her dress like she could rip it apart. "You don't understand what was at stake. That inheritance, if it went to you too, everything we built would have been destroyed. We would have been ruined." James let out a bitter laugh, the kind that didn't sound like him anymore. "You mean your lifestyle would have been ruined? You cared more about the house, the cars, the vacations than about your own children. You left me to suffocate in the dark just so you could keep pretending this family was perfect." My father finally looked up, his jaw tight. "It wasn't supposed to go that far," he muttered. His voice was low, almost broken, but every word carried the weight of guilt. "You weren't supposed to wake up. We thought it would be quick, painless. He stopped himself, his eyes darting to mine. "It was for survival." I felt something inside me snap. Survival? What they did had nothing to do with survival. It was greed dressed up as necessity. I stepped forward, holding the will in my hand like evidence in a courtroom. "Grandpa trusted us. He left everything to James and me because he knew what kind of people you were. And you proved him right." My mother pressed her hands to her face, rocking back and forth. My father stayed frozen, his eyes fixed on James as if seeing him alive was the cruelest punishment of all. The longer I watched them, the clearer it became. They weren't sorry for what they did. They were sorry they failed. James reached for my arm, pulling me slightly back. His voice was quieter now, but edged with fire. "They're already thinking about how to fix this. Don't let them fool you. This isn't over." And he was right. I could see it in my father's eyes. The calculations, the silent scramble for a way to take back control. I didn't give them a chance to speak again. "You don't get to talk your way out of this. From now on, you don't make the rules. We do." I took James upstairs before either of them could move. The hallway felt longer than usual, every shadow heavier, the weight of betrayal hanging in the air like smoke after a fire. In my room, James sat on the edge of the bed, rubbing his hands together like he was trying to ground himself. He looked older than he had days ago, as if the coffin they tried to bury him in had stolen pieces of him. "Do you realize what we're holding?" he asked me, nodding toward the envelope still clutched in my hand. "This isn't just about money. This is about power. That will make everything they've done useless. If we take this to court, if we expose the forged signatures, everything they've stolen collapses. Their reputation, their wealth, everything they've built, it's gone." I sat down beside him, staring at the papers spread across my lap. He was right, but part of me hesitated, not because I doubted what needed to be done, but because I knew the storm that would follow once we made the first move. "They won't let it get that far," I said slowly. "If they were willing to bury you alive, imagine what they'll do now that you're standing here with proof in your hands." James nodded. "Then we need to be smarter than them." That night, the house felt like it was alive, every creak of the floorboards sounding like footsteps, every shadow twisting with menace. My parents didn't come upstairs. I didn't hear them whispering or arguing. They stayed hidden, silent, waiting. I didn't trust the quiet. Neither did James. We barely slept, sitting side by side with the documents spread out between us, trying to piece together how deep this went. The will was straightforward. Everything my grandfather owned was to be split evenly between us. But the attachments, the letters from lawyers, the stamped agreements, revealed how carefully my parents had worked to erase it. There were dates that didn't match, pages missing, signatures clearly altered, and tucked at the back was something neither of us expected, a letter written by my grandfather himself. I unfolded it slowly. The paper yellowed, but the handwriting still sharp. It wasn't long, but every word hit like a hammer. He wrote that he couldn't trust my parents with what he had built. He had seen their obsession with appearances, their hunger for more, and he feared what they would do if given control. He wrote that James and I were his legacy, and everything was meant for us. It was his last act of protection, and somehow they had turned it into an act of betrayal. James clenched his fists as I read it aloud. He knew what they were capable of, and he was right. I folded the letter back into the envelope. My throat burned, but I forced myself to speak clearly. Then we finished what he started. We take this and make sure they can't hide anymore. By morning, the storm outside had passed, but inside the house the tension only thickened. My parents moved carefully, their eyes following us, their voices soft, rehearsed, pretending they were trying to keep the family intact. They made breakfast, laid it on the table, spoke about ordinary things as if nothing had changed. It was almost laughable, this performance of normalcy, this desperate attempt to rewrite the truth even as James sat there alive, proof of their crime. I didn't touch the food. James didn't either. We sat in silence, letting them squirm under the weight of it. Finally, my father broke. "We can fix this," he said, his fork clattering against the plate. "There doesn't have to be a war. If you give us the documents, we can come to an agreement. You'll still have more than enough. No one outside this family needs to know what happened." James leaned forward, his voice cutting through the air. "You think this is about money? You think you can buy our silence after everything you did? You buried me alive." His words landed like a slap. My mother flinched, tears spilling again, while my father sat back, his jaw clenching, his mask slipping. I met his gaze. "You don't get to negotiate. You had your chance. Now it's over." We left the table, leaving them frozen in their seats, and went back upstairs. James shut the door behind us, his breathing uneven. "They're desperate," he said, "which means they're dangerous." He was right. That night, as the house fell into quiet again, I couldn't shake the feeling that the walls were closing in. Our parents weren't going to sit back and let us take everything from them. They would strike again. The only question was how and when. I stayed awake, staring at the envelope on my nightstand, knowing that inside it was both our salvation and the reason our lives were in danger. James lay on the other side of the room, restless, his body jerking at every sound. We both knew the truth. This wasn't just about inheritance anymore. It was about survival. And as dawn broke, painting the room in pale light, I realized something that made my stomach twist. Exposing them in court might destroy them, but it might destroy us too. Because once the secret was out, the world wouldn't see us as victims. They would see us as heirs to a fortune drenched in betrayal, a family rotting from the inside. The day after James returned, the house no longer felt like home. Every room was a battlefield waiting to ignite. My parents tiptoed through the halls, their voices low, their faces pale from sleepless nights. James and I stayed close together, guarding the letter like it was the last thread holding our lives in place. We both knew it couldn't continue like this. One side had to fall. By noon, the air was so tense it felt like the walls themselves were pressing against us. My father appeared in the doorway, his expression unreadable, his voice calm but heavy. "We need to talk. All of us. No more hiding." His eyes flicked to the envelope in my hand, then back to James. "Tonight. At dinner." I didn't respond, but James stepped forward. "Fine." But this time, we're the ones who decide how it ends. That evening, the table was set with care, the kind of presentation my mother used for holidays. But the plates and silverware didn't hide the truth. This wasn't a meal, it was a final confrontation. My parents sat at one end, James and I at the other. The food went untouched. No one came here to eat. My father's voice cut through the silence. "You've made your point. You're angry, and you have every right to be. But tearing this family apart doesn't help anyone. If this will goes public, it destroys us all. Everything we've built, everything we've worked for, it will turn to ash. You'll inherit nothing but a ruined name." James leaned back, his eyes cold. "We already lost everything the moment you decided your own son was worth less than money. The only thing left is the truth." My mother's hands trembled on the table. "We didn't want to hurt you," she said softly, looking at me. "We wanted to protect you. Your grandfather didn't understand what it took to keep this family together. He didn't see what was at stake. We did what we had to do." I met her gaze, my voice steady. "You didn't protect us. You buried him. You lied to me. You wanted us gone so you could keep pretending this family was something it never was." The mask slipped from her face. She stopped crying, stopped pleading. Instead, her voice hardened. "And what happens if you take this to court? You think the world will see you as victims? They'll see you as greedy children who turned on their parents for money. They'll tear this family apart piece by piece, and you'll never be free of it. The press, the lawyers, the endless whispers, you'll drown in it." James leaned forward, his voice sharp. "Better drowned in truth than suffocated by lies." My father's hands clenched on the table, his calm facade breaking. "You don't understand what you're starting. Once this begins, there's no turning back." I pulled the letter from my bag, placing it on the table between us. "There never was any turning back. You made that choice when you put him in that coffin." The silence that followed was unbearable. My parents stared at the envelope, their faces stripped of pretense. I could see the calculation in their eyes, what they could still salvage, what they could still control. For a moment, I thought my father would lunge across the table, but instead, he leaned back, his voice low. "Then you leave us no choice." The shift in the room was instant. James's body tensed beside me, and I gripped the envelope tighter. My mother's tears vanished completely, her eyes sharp as blades. My father's tone was calm, but it carried finality. "If this comes out, you destroy yourselves along with us. But if you walk away, if you let this go, we can make you disappear. We can make sure no one ever knows." I stared at them, realization hitting like a cold blade. They weren't asking for compromise. They were threatening us. If we didn't destroy the letter, they would. And if we didn't vanish quietly, they'd make sure we vanished another way. James broke the silence first. "You already tried once. Do it again, and I promise the world will know exactly who you are." He stood, pushing his chair back, his voice like steel. "This ends tonight." I rose with him, clutching the envelope. For a moment, It felt like we were staring at two strangers across the table, people who wore our parents' faces but had nothing of family left inside them. My father's jaw tightened, my mother's hands curled into fists, but neither moved. They knew the war was already lost. We didn't give them another chance to speak. James and I walked out of the dining room, out of the house, and into the night air that felt heavier than ever. For the first time since he appeared at my door, James looked at me with something like relief. "We're not going back," he said. We didn't. The next morning, we drove straight into the city, the envelope locked in the glove compartment. At the law office, we handed over the documents to a lawyer who specialized in contested estates. His face changed as he read through the pages, shock, then recognition, then certainty. He looked up at us and said the words that made it real. "This is airtight. They don't stand a chance." The process wasn't quick. Court hearings, endless paperwork, the kind of scrutiny that burned every detail of our family into the public eye. My parents fought with everything they had, but the forged signatures, the altered documents, and the letter from my grandfather were undeniable. Piece by piece, their empire crumbled. The house, the cars, the accounts. They were stripped away until nothing remained but the truth they tried so hard to bury. When the verdict came, James and I stood together as the judge ruled the estate rightfully ours. My parents sat across the courtroom, hollow shells of who they once pretended to be. My father's shoulders slumped, his face gray. My mother stared down at her lap, refusing to look at us. They had lost everything, and for the first time, there was nothing left for them to take. Outside the courthouse, cameras flashed, reporters shouted questions, but none of it mattered. What mattered was that James was alive, and the truth had been dragged into the light. We didn't speak to the reporters. We didn't explain. We walked past them in silence, side by side, carrying the weight of survival, but also the strength of having fought back. That night, in the small apartment we had rented away from the chaos, James sat across from me at the table. The letter lay between us, its edges worn from being handled so many times. "Grandpa tried to protect us," he said quietly. "And in the end, he did. He gave us the weapon we needed." I nodded, my voice steady, and we finished what he started. For the first time in weeks, I felt the tension in my chest ease. The storm was over. We had faced the darkest truth of our family, and though the scars would never fade, we were still standing. James reached across the table, his hand steady as it closed over mine. We didn't need to say anything else. The war was done. The inheritance was ours. The truth was no longer buried. And our parents, once the people we trusted most, were nothing more than ghosts left behind.